To continue our discussion on blending and fading, here we're going to see a blending method that has been used for many centuries now. We're going to call it the multilayer method. In this course, we will mostly use it for reworks, but I think it's a good point to start seeing practically how to blend and fade colors. We call it multilayer because its structure is based on different layers of dried oil paint overlapped. So naturally the question is, if we're going to cover the dry layer below, how can we blend them? And this is the very interesting part because we actually don't blend them. It's the light that mixing somehow waves of different wavelengths, it's pushing our brain to generate the perception of a different color. Before we start to get deep in this subject, we have to remember that with this method we have to change our way to prepare the palette. We have seen already a few times that in order to avoid problems when we overlap two or more layers of oil paint, we have to make the polymerization of the bottom layer faster than the top layer. And one of the solutions that we always want to use is to make the top layer thinner than the bottom layer. So in this case we're going to prepare our palette like we normally do. And once finished we're going to add some extra medium on each color. To start, we're going to see an example on how to blend different colors. So, as first, we're going to paint a whole canvas with some cobalt blue and wait until it gets dry. Then, we're gonna paint it using some lemon yellow. We can see almost immediately that the yellow turned into green. But the interesting part is that now, if using a white makeup pad we take the green off the canvas, we can see that it's actually still yellow. On the other side, if we're gonna paint our blue canvas using some Naples yellow, the color is not gonna change. This happened because they have different opacities. We have used them a few times already, so we know that this lemon yellow is made with a transparent pigment, while for the Naples yellow they have used a very opaque one. Physically, what happens is that when the light reaches the two yellow paints, it behaves in two different ways. When the light hits the Naples yellow, all the waves with the wavelengths within the blue area get absorbed inside the paint, while those waves with the wavelengths within the yellow area get reflected. But when the light hits the lemon yellow, things change. Since this is a transparent pigment, only a portion of the yellow wave bounces on the external surface and get reflected, while the rest of it gets refracted past through the paint layer reaching the blue below, where it gets absorbed. When the blue wave hits the lemon yellow, as usually it gets refracted and it passes through the external surface. But this time only a small portion gets absorbed by the yellow paint, while the rest reach the blue below, where they get reflected and sent out in the opposite direction. At this point, yellow and blue waves travel together, and when they reach our eyes, our brain is gonna make us believe that that color is green. We're going to paint now a thick lemon yellow stain over the cobalt blue. And we can see that where the color is thicker, it still looks yellow, while where the paint gets thinner, it turns into green. And we get somehow what we have called a fading. And this is basically how the multilayer fading works. We fade colors by playing with their opacities and thicknesses. By the physical point of view, we get the perception of the two color fading because when the light hits the yellow paint, where it's very thick, the run of the blue waves inside the yellow is too long to be able to pass through and they get absorbed. While the thickness decreases, the blue radiation starts to reach the blue layer below and it bounces back. But it still gets absorbed on the way back, so we can't see it. Until, on a certain point, it begins to pass through and we start to have the perception of the green. While the yellow paint thickness decreases, the intensity of the blue waves keep increasing, and the green becomes darker and darker until it starts to be perceived as blue, and at the end, when there is no more yellow, the transition is complete. Now that we know how this physically works, how can we do this practically on a support? As we said, blending and fading colors with this method, it's a matter of opacity and thickness. And since we only control the opacity when we choose our paints and eventually when we thin them down, if we want to learn how to blend and fade colors using this method, we have to learn how to control their thickness on the support. Now, if we remember when we have talked about uniform painting, also in that case working with transparent and semi-transparent pigments, we have to learn how to control their thickness, and we have to make them uniform. At the end, what we did, it was just blending our colors with the white of the canvas below. If we want to control the final color blending with this method, we have to control the thickness of the top layer. If it is very thin, the final color will be mostly influenced by the bottom layer. But while the top layer thickness increases, it becomes more influent until on a certain point that we will call the covering thickness, the bottom layer influence will completely disappear. The covering thickness depends on the opacity, and it will be thicker in very transparent pigment and pretty thin for the very opaque. Controlling the thickness at the end means to be able to control how we unload our brush on the support, and this most of the time is related with the quantity of paint that we have loaded in its belly. Before we start to see how the fading process works, we have to make some preliminary consideration. Let's load a flat brush with some lemon yellow, and let's make a straight line on the cobalt blue. As we can see, the belly has released most of the paint in the first part of its run, and gradually the quantity decreases until at the end the stroke is almost empty. If we watch the stroke carefully, we can actually see that it's made by many parallel lines, and this is a very important concept. A single brush stroke makes a certain number of lines, all parallel between them and going in the stroke direction, that increase with the increasing of the brush size. If we look at those line colors, as we could expect for what we have seen so far, on the left, where the paint is pretty thick, many lines are still yellow and others are light green. While moving on the right, while the paint thickness decreases, they all turn into light green first and then into dark green to become almost blue at the end of the stroke. Another thing that we have to notice is that only the part of the belly facing the support was unloaded, while the opposite face is still loaded. So if we flip the brush, we are able to make a second line in the opposite direction. Now let's change color to the zinc and titanium white, and let's make a similar stroke. Also in this case there are many lines, but on the left they are all white and it's almost impossible to see the difference. They all turn in a very light blue on the right at the end of the stroke, where we can also start to see the difference between them. To make this line uniform, we have to pass over it a few times to move the paint right where we need it. And also this is a very important concept. Now, if without loading the brush we're gonna make a second line below, we can see that its white starts to be influenced by the blue. If we make another line, the blue influence becomes stronger, and so on until on the last line the white almost disappears. If we look carefully to these lines, we can see that they are pretty similar to something that we have already seen. Now, to turn these steps into fading lines, we have to use all the things that we have seen so far. The first is that a single brush stroke makes many lines all parallel between them in the stroke direction. And in this case, this means that to make the fading lines, we have to use our brush in their direction. Then, if we remember, each fading line was made by a single uniform color, and in our case, to do this, we have to pass over them many times. So we have to keep brushing in the fading lines direction. The last is that to make the variable thickness that we need to fade the two colors with this method, we have to unload the brush in the faded direction. And in our case, this means that we have to move it slowly perpendicularly to our stroking. There are other considerations that we have to do. The first is, what we have seen now, it's what we call a straight fading, because all the fading lines are straight. But if we had to make a circular fading, as we have seen, we have to follow with our brush the fading lines direction. And this means that we have to make circular strokes. And if we want to make an irregular shape, like for example this one, we need to follow with our brush the path of the shape. The second consideration is that while we are brushing, between the paint concentration on the support and the one on the brush belly, there is a sort of connection. If the concentration on the support is lower than the one on the belly, the brush will unload the paint on the support. If, on the other side, the concentration on the support is higher, the brush will load paint from the support. So, for example, if there is too much color on our canvas and while we're brushing we can't get the fading we want, we can change our brush with a clean one or clean the one we are using. In this way, when we will go back brushing, we won't only control the uniformity of the fading line, but also their color. The last consideration that we have to do is that when we load our brush on the palette, most of the paint gets trapped on the tip. And when we unload it on the support, most of the paint gets out in the first part of the stroke. And this can be a problem if we want to make a very thin layer. In this case, it's better to unload the brush a little before we do our job on the support. As we said, we're going to use this method only to do reworks, and we're going to have a whole video later where we will see many practical examples on how to use it. For now, we have concluded our discussion on multi-layer blending and fading. In the next video, we're going to see the mixed method.
If you enjoyed this video, we will really appreciate if you could click on like and subscribe to our channel. It will also help us very much if you could leave a comment. Thank you for watching this video and see you in the next one.